All right, ready to get a little spooky. We're talking vampires today, but not quite the sparkly kind.
Definitely not.
We're going way back to the roots of vampire folklore, like the real deal. Think less Hollywood, more what actual cultures believed about these creatures for
That's
centuries.
fascinating stuff, really.
We've got our Wikipedia entries fired up here. Vampires, Strigoi, Striga, you name it. Get ready for some serious folklore deep dive.
I think you'll be surprised how much these stories reflect some pretty universal human fears, especially when it comes to death, the big mystery.
And speaking of death, our vampire Wikipedia entry, it starts off pretty basic. Mythical beings, feeding on life force, usually blood. You know the drill. But here's where things take a turn.
Oh, yeah.
Forget your pale, brooding Edward Cullen types. The original vampires, a lot of times they were described as, well, bloated, and not just a little. Ruddy skin, some even said dark skin.
Makes sense if you think about it.
Mm.
Imagine seeing a body after death without knowing anything about decomposition.
Yikes. Yeah.
That bloating, the way the skin changes color?
People would freak out.
Totally. It would seem like some unholy life force was sticking around way past its welcome.
So maybe garlic wasn't the only thing those old vampire hunters needed. Maybe some, like, heavy-duty air freshener, huh?
Right.
And it gets weirder. Some folklore even said vampires, their hair and nail, it looked like they kept growing even after death.
That's decomposition for you. The skin retracts, exposes more of the hair and nails.
Ugh, okay, never thought about it like that.
Back then, people saw that and they thought, no way, they're still growing. This is unnatural.
Giant misunderstanding with terrifying results. And those misunderstandings, they led to some pretty out there beliefs. Like, did you know there were cultures where just a cat jumping over a corpse, that alone could make it come back as a vampire?
Really.
Yeah. Talk about bad luck for Fluffy.
It does seem random, but you see this in Slavic folklore, even Chinese folklore.
Yeah.
And it speaks to this deep fear of unseen forces and the need for rituals, to keep things in order, especially after death.
So it's like they're trying to control every little detail to avoid something way worse.
Exactly.
We think we've got funeral arrangements down to a science NW wine. Right, this is next level.
It really puts it in perspective, doesn't it? The universality of that fear, the fear of the undead. And it's not just one place either. We're talking about vampire stories popping up on every continent.
Everywhere.
Oh, yeah. But here's the catch. How those vampires came to be, it changes depending on where you are in the world. You've got your classic blood-sucking monsters, sure. But then there's something like the Albanian Dhampir.
Dhampir, okay, that's a new one. What is that? Some kind of vampire buffet?
Not quite. The Dhampir is different. They're not made by a cat or a curse. They're born from a werewolf. Or, as they say in Albanian folklore, a Karkank's hole.
Whoa, hold on. So we're already doubling down on the monster trouble here. What's the story with these Dhampir?
Well, they represent a different kind of fear. The fear of, well, let's say the unusual child. Imagine you survived childbirth, which, let's be honest, wasn't exactly a walk in the park back then.
Right.
And then there's this lingering fear. What if your child isn't entirely human?
Oh, so it's like folklore's way of saying, congrats on surviving childbirth, now worry about this.
Pretty much. And to make it even more interesting, the Dhampir are often depicted as being able to sense other vampires, even kill them, like a built-in defense mechanism against the very thing they're, born from.
Okay, that's kind of cool. Not all bad then. At least not if you're not on the vampire's bad side. But let's talk about protecting yourself from these creatures, because I'm guessing a firm talking to isn't going to cut it.
You'd be surprised by the lengths people went to. Garlic and steaks, yeah, those are famous, but those are just the beginning. Burying corpses upside down, for example, that shows up in cultures all over.
Upside down, like they're planting a vampire tree or something. What's the logic there?
Couple of schools of thought on that one. Some thought it would confuse the reanimated corpse, send them digging in the wrong direction. Others thought it would just make it harder for them to claw their way out.
Wow, talk about desperate times. I can just imagine these conversations back in the day. All right, before we bury Uncle Bob, one more thing. Honey, grab the shovel. You're on leg duty. But it gets even weirder. Both Chinese and Indian folklore, they believed vampires had this thing about counting.
Counting.
Yeah, like sprinkle some rice around your house and boom, instant vampire deterrent. You're safe because, they'll be stuck counting grains all night.
Right, like they're going to get distracted by a little bit of rice.
It sounds crazy now, but back then.
It was all about control. Even if it's a monster, people want to believe they can outsmart it, find a way to feel safe.
So If I'm ever facing down a vampire, I'm grabbing a big bag of rice and what was it, shovel, you know, just to be safe. But enough about vampire defenses. Let's head over to Romania, home of the Strigoi. They're like Dracula's way more intense older cousin, you know?
The Strigos are interesting because, well, they didn't start out as the blood-sucking monsters we think of today.
Yeah.
No, really. The name itself might come from the word for owl. Early on, they were more tied to witches and dark magic, not so much draining people's blood.
Hold on, so you're telling me I gotta watch out for vampire owls now. That's a visual, all right?
Right. It just shows you how these myths, they evolve, they pick up new fears and superstitions as they go. And speaking of picking things up, there's this guy, Ger Grando, from the 16th century. He's considered by some to be like the first officially documented vampire.
Yeah.
And his story really cemented that link between the Strigoi and the modern vampire we all know and maybe you're a little bit afraid of.
Wow, so it's like watching a monster be born right there in the history books. But you know what's really scary?
What's that?
The Striga, this Albanian vampire, it's like nightmare fuel, even compared to the others.
Oh yeah, the Striga or something else.
Forget grown-ups. This one targets babies, steals their blood in the night, and if that wasn't bad enough, it can turn into a moth. A moth.
It's a truly disturbing figure. And I think that focus on infants, it speaks to a very real horror, especially back then. Infant mortality was so tragically common.
Oh, absolutely.
Can you imagine losing a child, maybe not even understanding why they were sick?
Right, like what do you even blame something like that on?
Exactly. And the Striga, this monstrous figure, became the embodiment of that fear and grief. And even the way they're described.
Yeah, they're creepy looking for sure.
Disfigured face, piercing eyes, you know.
Uh-huh.
It plays into that very human tendency, unfortunately, to equate what's different, what maybe looks a little strange, with evil.
Sadly, that's something that hasn't gone away even now. We still see that, don't we? That fear of the unknown, of what's different. But, you know, it's not just Eastern Europe or the Balkans that have a monopoly on these vampire-like creatures.
Not at all. These stories are everywhere. Like the Isambosom of West Africa, for example. It hides in the trees, waits to snatch people with these iron teeth.
Sounds charming. I'll be sure to add that to my places to avoid after dark list.
Right. And then there's the ads from Ghana. Shape-shifting vampire. It can even turn into a firefly, lure children away.
Okay, now that's just messing with you. Fireflies, come on. That's low, even for a vampire. But what about, like, America? Did early Americans have their own vampire myths?
They did. In the 18th and 19th centuries, New England had this huge vampire panic, all because of tuberculosis outbreaks. Back then, they called it consumption.
Tuberculosis. Wait, seriously. But that's a disease, not a supernatural creature.
You're right, of course. Now we know. But back then, people didn't get how germs and bacteria worked. So imagine you see someone wasting away, their skin getting paler, they can't stop coughing.
They just look sick.
Right. But back then, it was easy to see that as something sinister, something vampiric.
It's wild, right? Something we can treat with antibiotics now. Back then, it was like the ultimate horror movie.
Shows you how far we've come in understanding how diseases actually work. But it also shows how easily we can get tripped up by fear, especially when we don't have the answers.
And those fears, they tend to stick around, don't they? Like we're drawn to those old stories, those old monsters.
It's comforting in a way, isn't it? Even if it's scary, at least it's familiar.
Speaking of familiar, you'd think these days, with all our fancy science and technology, vampire hunting would be a thing of the past, right? Like, who's staking bodies in 2024? Well,
Don't tell me.
Romania, 2004. A body was dug up because the family thought it might be a vampire.
You're kidding?
Nope. True story. Makes you think, huh?
It really does. All our progress, and some things just don't change. It's like those old beliefs, those fears. They're buried deep down, but they never really go away.
It makes you wonder what people will be digging up hundreds of years from now, right? What will future generations think about our superstitions?
Funny, isn't it? We think we're so advanced, but really, we're not that different from our ancestors who were sprinkling rice around their houses to ward off vampires.
Hey, don't knock it till you try it. But you're right, some things are universal. That fear of the unknown, the things that go bump in the night.
It's part of what makes us human, I think.
Yeah.
That fascination with the darkness, with the monsters, both real and imagined.
And maybe, just maybe, those stories about vampires, they help us face those fears, even if it's just in a roundabout way.
Gives us a way to explore what scares us most without actually having to, face down a blood-sucking monster in the dark.
Exactly. Although I still might keep some rice handy, just in case. But that, my friends, is a wrap on our deep dive into the world of vampire folklore. Hope you enjoyed exploring the history, the myths, and the, let's call them creative vampire defenses with us. Until next time, keep it spooky.